Hello and welcome to our webinar, an MMPI-3 overview. We would like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Yossef Ben-Porath. Dr. Ben-Porath is a professor of psychological sciences at Kent State University and a board-certified clinical psychologist. He received his doctoral training at the University of Minnesota and has been involved extensively in MMPI research for the past 35 years. Dr. Ben-Porath is a co-developer of the MMPI-3, MMPI-2RF, and MMPI-ARF, and co-author of numerous test manuals, books, chapters, and articles on the MMPI instruments. He has served as editor-in-chief of the journals Psychological Assessment and Assessment, and as a member of APA's Committee on Psychological Tests and Assessment. Dr. Ben-Porath's clinical practice involves supervision of assessment at Kent State Psychological Clinic and consultation to agencies that screen candidates for public safety positions. He also provides consultation and expert witness in services in forensic areas. We are extremely pleased to have him here today to provide us an overview of the upcoming MMPI-3. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio only, so there's no phone lines. Please turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio. If you're having any connectivity or audio issues, please click on the question mark at the top right-hand side of your screen for assistance. Please type any questions that you have into the chat box. We will answer questions live, time permitting, or we will follow up with you via email after the webinar. The webinar handout is located under your chat box in the Events Resources. Click on Events Resources and you can download it from there during the webinar. There are no CEUs associated with this webinar today. Please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. You will receive an email from do-not-reply@webcast.com with a link to your certificate. With all that being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ben-Porath.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and good day, everyone. Welcome to our overview of the MMPI-3 webinar. Before starting with the presentation, I'd like to offer a disclosure of my interest in the instrument we're discussing today. I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, and to our distributor, Pearson. I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press, and as co-author of the MMPI-2RF and the MMPI-3, I receive royalties on sales of test materials. With that, we'll go ahead and look at our agenda for the webinar. We'll begin with a brief history of the MMPI instruments and place the MMPI-3 within that context, then talk a little bit about the goals for the MMPI-3 and its development. We'll then discuss the new norms that will be available with the MMPI-3, and then take a look at the manuals, users guides, and reports for the MMPI-3 as well, and leave time at the end for our question and answer session. As Sherry, I believe, mentioned, if you do have questions along the way, do feel free to type them into the chat box. I will not be monitoring the chat box, but we'll get to as many of the questions that come in during the presentation, during the Q&A session at the end. So with that, we'll go over our brief MMPI-3 or MMPI history, beginning, of course, with the original MMPI that was introduced in 1943 with the goal of developing a differential diagnostic indicator that could be given to any patient at the University of Minnesota Hospital, where the test was developed by Stark Hathaway and Charlie McKinley. The initial intent was that the test could very directly indicate whether a patient had one or more of the targeted psychiatric diagnoses. Didn't quite work as well as they had planned, and in fact, they wound up, the original developers and researchers of the MMPI, switching to a very different approach, a code type classification-based system for classifying profiles into different types and establishing the empirical correlates associated with membership in these different code types. Validity scales, of course, were also part of the original MMPI, as were a host of supplementary measures that were introduced over the years. And the norms for the original MMPI were collected in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The MMPI-2 was released in 1989 with two primary objectives: to collect new norms, to update the 1930s, early 40s norms, and also to enhance coverage of certain content domains that were not included in the original MMPI. The norms for the MMPI-2 were collected in the mid-1980s. The clinical scales, the original clinical scales, were left essentially intact. So a new item was introduced via a set of content scales that were part of the MMPI-2. Some new validity scales also were introduced with the MMPI-2. There was some initial skepticism expressed about the MMPI-2 when it first came out, specifically about whether the code types could still be interpreted on the basis of the original literature, given the normative changes. But within a relatively quick period of time, the MMPI-2 was adopted for use by most of the users of the original MMPI. The MMPI-2RF was released in 2008. Auke Tellegen and I are the authors of the restructured form. Our goal, as indicated here in the slide, was to represent the clinically significant substance of the MMPI-2 item pool with a comprehensive set of psychometrically adequate measures. And one of the primary goals was to address some of the psychometric shortcomings of the original clinical scales that had been long recognized and discussed in the literature. And that was a primary objective of the development of the restructured clinical scales. We believed that we would wind up with a more efficient instrument that wouldn't require all 567 items. And indeed, we wound up using only 338 of the 567 MMPI-2 items. And as I mentioned, the first step was restructuring the clinical scales and then augmenting those RC scales with the additional measures needed to achieve a comprehensive assessment of the constructs that could be reliably and validly assessed with the MMPI-2 item pool. Now, the MMPI-3, of course, is being released shortly. In fact, the release date is September 26th, so we're quite close to the release of the MMPI-3. Two primary objectives here were to collect new norms. The MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF norms are now more than 30 years old, and to enhance content coverage to essentially build on the foundations, the strong psychometric foundations of the MMPI-2RF, add some new scales, enhance some of the existing MMPI-2RF scales with items covering domains that were not fully covered by the MMPI-2. And then, of course, most importantly, collect English and Spanish language norms for the instrument. So those were the primary objectives for the MMPI-3. In terms of the development process itself, it began with some preliminary studies that we won't go into here, but the primary vehicle for development of the MMPI-3 was a booklet that we call the MMPI-2RF-EX, which stands for expanded. This expanded booklet included a brief biographical questionnaire, the 338 MMPI-2RF items, 43 of which were updated and simplified, 95 trial items that were candidates for inclusion on the MMPI-3. And of course, we had a booklet and an answer sheet that could be used for data collection. But also Pearson developed a separate version of QLocal-EX, specifically for this project. And this was important because we wanted to be able to collect data in the field where psychologists would administer the expanded version of the MMPI-2RF, but be able to score the MMPI, that is the EX booklet, but be able to score the MMPI-2RF and use it in actual applied assessments. And so that was why QLocal-EX was important. All of the material for the MMPI-2RF-EX, the biographical, all the items, the revised and new items as well, were translated into Spanish. The starting point here was the Garcia-Azan MMPI-2RF translation. A team led by Tony Puente at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington translated the rewritten items and the 95 trial items, and all of the material was therefore available in Spanish as well as it was in English. And if anyone from Pearson is monitoring this, I do hear some additional audio in the background, so if other microphones could be muted, I think that would be helpful. Continuing with the data collection, the plan here was to collect essentially three types of data. Field data, these were data that were collected in the sites. As I mentioned earlier, the goal here was to be able to administer the expanded booklet, score the MMPI-2RF, use it in actual applied assessments. And so these were sites representing the various settings in which the MMPI is typically used: mental health, used for some of the scale development analyses, separate data for the validation analyses, and also for the development of comparison groups. There also were a number of college student studies that were done, and these were used for some initial psychometric analyses and also some very detailed validation analyses where we were able to administer, in addition to the expanded booklet, to college students a very large range of supplementary or measures that were used for the detailed validation analyses, and of course normative data, and we'll talk about the normative data here shortly, but these were collected in English and in Spanish, and we also had a sample of individuals who were bilingual English-Spanish who were part of the normative data collection, and I'll mention here shortly how those data were used. In terms of what we've collected for field data, the numbers are here on this slide. You can see that we collected a very large number of protocols in various public safety settings. These included police officer candidate, correction officer candidate, dispatchers, individuals being assessed for positions in dispatch, as well as firefighter medics. Various mental health settings and medical settings, as well as criminal justice forensic assessments, correctional system assessments, and forensic disability evaluations for just over 16,000 individuals in our field data collection. The college student studies were about 8,000 individuals collected, not only by our group at Kent State, but also by other researchers who are collecting their own data for MMPI-3 studies that will soon begin to appear in the literature. And then for the normative data collection, we tested over 2,300 individuals in English. 280 of those were retested for the purpose of calculating test-retest reliability. 664 individuals tested in Spanish, 60 retested, 45 individuals in our bilingual sample, so over 3,400 individuals were tested as part of the normative data collection. So overall, to date, because we still are collecting some follow-up data, we've tested approximately 28,000 individuals with the expanded booklet from which we can score the MMPI-3. In terms of the scale development, just briefly, using the field data, we began by shortening some of the restructured clinical scales, making them no longer than they had to be in order to maintain their reliability and validity. And the goal here was to make room for some of the new items. Some of the specific problem scales were actually lengthened and expanded. And then the higher order and the Sci-5 scales were revised to address the items that had been deleted in the prior steps. We also updated the validity scales primarily by recalibrating the infrequency scales with current samples, so running item frequency analyses with current new samples that were collected for the MMPI-3. And then importantly, using the Spanish normative and bilingual samples, all of the rewritten items and any of the new items, the trial items that were ultimately selected for the MMPI-3 were examined to make sure that they worked well in Spanish. And one of them did not, so that item did not make it into the final booklet, but all of the items added to the MMPI-3 worked well in Spanish as they did in English in the analyses used to select those items. The outcome of this process includes 5 new scales that will be part of the MMPI-3. One is a new validity scale, combined response and consistency, that essentially, as the label implies, combines information from the VRIN and TRIN inconsistent response scales to give us an overall indication of the level of inconsistent responding. And then 4 new substantive scales include a scale called eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and a measure called self-importance that taps into grandiosity and related features. We also substantially modified a number of the MMPI-2RF scales. The anxiety scale was substantially enhanced with new items that get at a broader range of anxiety-related symptoms, and hence is now called anxiety-related experiences. The stress and worry scale was divided into 2 separate measures of stress and worry, and then the interpersonal passivity scale, the scoring key there was reversed, so that we now have a scale that in which higher scores indicate dominance or domineering behavior, and low scores on this scale will now be used to identify interpersonal passivity. We did drop a number of MMPI-2RF scales. This was necessary in order to make room for some of the new items that were added to the instrument. This includes the gastrointestinal and head pain complaints scales. Although the scales are not on the MMPI-3, some of the items from those scales remain on RC1. So we're still tapping into those types of complaints, but we don't have separate scales for them. Multiple specific fears, another scale that was dropped for the MMPI-3. And then the 2 interest scales, aesthetic, literary, and mechanical physical interest, also will not be part of the MMPI-3. Now, altogether, we wound up adding 72 of the 95 trial items, so 72 new items on the MMPI-3. We dropped 75 MMPI-2RF items, which leaves us with a total of 335 items on the MMPI-3. You can see here a breakdown. 220 of those 335 items are original MMPI items. 47 of those were revised from the original MMPI for the MMPI-2 or the MMPI-3. 43 MMPI-2 items, 5 were revised for the MMPI-3, and then the 72 new MMPI-3 items make up the total of 335 items. The reading level has not changed. It's a 4.5, grade 4.5 on the Flesch-Kincaid readability index, which was also the case for the MMPI-2RF. Altogether, we have 52 scales on the MMPI-3, 10 validity scales, the 10th one being the additional, the new CRIN scale that I just mentioned, combined response and consistency. We still maintain the same structure for the substantive scales, the hierarchical structure with 3 levels of measurement, 3 higher order scales. At the broadest level, the now 8 restructured clinical scales. One of the RC scales, RC3 or cynicism, now is included among the externalizing specific problem scales. So we have 8 RC scales at the 2nd tier of measurement, and then our 26 specific problem scales that identify in a more narrowly focused manner problems and concerns related to somatic and cognitive complaints, internalizing or externalizing dysfunction, and we have the 5 measures of interpersonal problems and the 5 Psi-5 scales that have been updated for the MMPI-3, the personality psychopathology 5 scales that focus on personality disorder related psychopathology, and our measures that are very similar to the alternative model of personality disorders that's a part of the DSM-5 for those who are familiar with that. We don't have time in an overview webinar to go over all of the scales. At the end of the presentation today, I'll mention some workshops coming up on the MMPI-3 for those who would like to get much more in-depth information about the scales and the MMPI-3 more generally. I do want to give you a sense, though, of one of the important aspects of the development of the MMPI-3, of course, was the collection of new norms now 30 plus years after the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF norms were collected. So we'll take a look at that in a little bit more depth here. The normative data were collected between September 2017 and December 2018. The University of Minnesota Press, our publisher, hired Eureka Facts, which is a market research firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., to do the data collection. This is a company that specializes in collecting data from difficult-to-reach populations, and particularly in working with individuals of Hispanic origin. And so they were the ones who did the data collection out in the field. Participants were paid $50 per session. So those who came back for a second retest were paid $50 again. All of the testing was done at prearranged locations, primarily hotel conference rooms in the various cities and locations where the data were collected. And 98% of the data collection was done by computer at those sites. And this was very helpful because it meant that we had almost immediate access to the data as they were being collected, and were able to monitor and make sure that we were hitting our targets for various demographic groups. So the English language normative sample was selected from all of the data collected in order to approximate projections that were available back when we were collecting the data for the 2020 census for race, education, and age. And the final sample, normative sample for the MMPI-3, is made up of 810 men, 810 women, for a total of 1,620 individuals. And T-scores on the standard T-scores on the MMPI-3 are non-gendered. They're based on the combined sample of 1,620 individuals, although it is possible to compare a test taker's results with just the men or just the women of the normative sample via comparison groups, as we'll discuss here shortly. So that's the English language normative sample in terms of numbers. In terms of where the data were collected, you can see on this slide that we collected data in various cities and locations representing different regions of the United States for the total of 1,620 individuals. You'll see near the bottom, West Virginia. We went into West Virginia in particular in order to make sure that we had a sufficient representation for more rural populations, although we did get some from some of the other sites, but that was done specifically for that purpose. In terms of the race distribution, a couple of things I'd like to point out here. In terms of the projections, the 2020 census projections for the proportion or percentage of white individuals in the adult population, this is for the adult population, the projection is 62.5%. You can see here that the MMPI-2RF, which of course is also the MMPI-2 normative sample, is almost 82% white. And so that's one of the biggest changes that has occurred. That was targeting the 1980 census when these data were first collected. And for the MMPI-3 normative sample, we have 60.3% white, so just under the 62.5 projection. And that, of course, is consistent with expectations that the proportion of white individuals will continue to decline. The projected composition of the adult population in terms of individuals of Hispanic origin is 16.8% for the 2020 census. Only 2.9% of the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF normative sample is of Hispanic origin. For our English language normative sample, we have 14%. Now, that, of course, is less than 16.8, but the 16.8 includes individuals who are non-English speakers, who, of course, would not be tested in English. 14% actually is a little bit higher than the expected proportion of English-speaking individuals of Hispanic origin. And, of course, we'll have separate norms for the Spanish translation that we'll talk about here shortly. In terms of age, we came pretty close to our targets in representing the different age bands. The only one where we fell a little bit short is in the 80-plus age range. The projection for 2020 is 5.1% of the population. We only wound up with 2.1% of our sample. It did prove to be a difficult population to reach, but this also, I think, represents the fact that individuals in their 80s are less and plus are less likely to be tested with the MMPI. We do plan to go back and collect some additional data and focus specifically on this population, as of course it's growing in the United States. In terms of education levels, one of the challenges with the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF normative sample was a relatively low representation or underrepresentation of individuals with no high school or GED in the normative sample, and an overrepresentation of individuals with college degrees in the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF normative sample. You can see that for the MMPI-3, we've come closer to the 2020 census projections, just a slight overrepresentation of the college population, college-educated population of the United States, and a little bit below the projections for less than a high school education. Again, this is subpopulation that's less likely to be tested with an MMPI instrument, but we will continue to work and study specifically the use of the test with individuals with lower than high school levels of education. Of course, the next important question is, now that we have a new normative sample, have the norms changed? This is a question that we can answer directly with the data that we collected, because we're able to score the MMPI-2RF for the new normative sample. So what we're looking at here are the mean scores for the men and women of the MMPI-3 normative sample, scored on the basis of the MMPI-2RF norms. Now, if the norms were unchanged, what we would expect to see is all the means equal 50 and all the standard deviations equal 10. That would tell us that the norms really haven't changed in the 30 plus years since the MMPI-2RF norms were collected. But of course, that's not what we expected nor what we see. So you can see here, for example, on the FR scale, the means are about half a standard deviation, 56 above the general population for the previous, or the mean for the previous normative sample. The standard deviations are greater than 10, and these two differences actually offset each other to some extent in terms of impacting the norms for the MMPI-3. We also see that on LR, the new normative sample scores about half a standard deviation above the previous normative sample for the MMPI-2RF. In terms of the substantive scales, we can see that RC1 is a little bit higher for our new normative samples, and no more reporting of somatic complaints. RC4, particularly for the men, as well as RC6, about half a standard deviation above the previous mean. On the specific problem scales, we see on the malaise scale actually the largest difference, 7 and 8 T-score points respectively for the men and women in the new normative sample compared to the previous normative sample. Nothing particularly noteworthy here with our externalizing, interpersonal, and interest scales, and also the case with the Sci-5 scales, where we do see a fairly consistent gender difference on the disconstraint scale. So what does this all mean? Have the norms changed? The answer is yes. The largest validity scale changes of 5 to 6 T-score points are on the scales listed here on this slide. However, as I mentioned, these mean score differences are offset to some extent by the larger standard deviations. However, T-scores will be lower once we transition to the MMPI-3 norms on the updated and renormed scales listed here in the slide. And we also are going to find some lower T-scores on the scales, the substantive scales mentioned here as well. So yes, there are some normative changes. Next, we wanted to take a look at the Spanish language norms. These data were collected, you could see, in various sites, not as many of the sites, obviously, as we collected the English language normative data, a total of 550 individuals in the Spanish language normative sample, 275 men and 275 women. You can see here that almost everyone self-identified as Hispanic or mixed race, a few self-identified as other. But of course, everyone in this sample was fluent in Spanish. They were selected for being fluent in Spanish and produced valid MMPI-3 protocols in Spanish. So we're quite confident that they were fluent in Spanish. We also, and all of these data, by the way, appear in the various manuals that I'll be going over here shortly, but you can see that we also report a breakdown of the ancestral origins of the participants in our Spanish language normative sample, breakdown of ages, as well as education, which is fairly evenly distributed across our 4 education groups for the Spanish language normative sample. Now, to answer the question of whether separate norms are needed for the Spanish language version of the test, what we did is to plot the mean scores of our Spanish language normative sample on now using the English language MMPI-3 norms. So again, if the two normative samples, the two new normative samples, scored similarly, then what we would expect are means of 50 and standard deviations of 10. To the extent that these means and standard deviations for the Spanish language normative sample deviate from 50 and 10, that would represent differences between the two normative samples. And we can see here, for example, that the Spanish language normative sample scores a little more than half a standard deviation above the mean, the English language mean on the FP scale. And even more so on the L scale. Again, this is going to be to some extent offset by the larger standard deviation that we find in the Spanish language normative sample. The Spanish language sample score is a little bit lower than the English language one on the behavioral externalizing dysfunction higher order scale, lower on malaise, but substantially higher on behavior restricting fears. On the externalizing and interpersonal scales, the means are fairly close to the English language means, and with the exception of disconstraint, the same is true for the Psi-5 scales. So most of the means in the Spanish language normative sample fall within 5 T-score points of the English language norms. There are some exceptions. There's somewhat reduced variability particularly with the substantive scales, all of which told us that indeed separate norms are needed and are available for the Spanish language translation of the MMPI-3. Turning to our manuals and users guides for the MMPI-3, this is our manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation. It will include the usual information, users, qualifications, normative sample, description of the normative sample, administration and scoring, standard administration and scoring procedures, comprehensive interpretive guidelines. Everything you need to interpret the MMPI-3 will be covered in the interpretation chapter, which also includes some case illustrations, and then scoring keys, T-score conversion tables, and some information about the reading level of the 335 MMPI-3 items. We have a separate technical manual for the MMPI-3. You can see that the cover also lists a number of individuals who contributed data or other input that are listed as contributors to the MMPI-3 technical manual. The manual will provide information about test development, reliability data, standard errors of measurement, and then the bulk of the technical manual involves 2 appendixes, or includes 2 appendixes. Appendix D, where we report empirical correlations between scores on the substantive scales of the MMPI-3 and extra test data collected in various mental health, medical, forensic, and public safety settings. This is the table of contents for Appendix D, and you can see it's made up of 144 tables and nearly 38,000 validity coefficients, correlations between scores on the substantive scales of the MMPI-3 and extra test data, in some instances ratings by clinicians, and others based on reviews of records, and for others we used other established self-report measures as the criteria. Appendix E, the second large appendix in the technical manual, provides comparisons between the empirical correlates of MMPI-2RF and MMPI-3 versions of scales. So scales that were updated for the MMPI-3, because we were able to score with the expanded booklet both versions of the test, both the RF and the MMPI-3 for all test takers. We were then able to directly compare the validity coefficients for scores, correlations with external criteria. So this is the table of content for Appendix E. You can see that we have nearly 39,000 validity coefficients in Appendix E. And basically what these data demonstrate is that the correlates are comparable, that the correlates of the MMPI-3 versions of the scales are comparable, or in some cases stronger than the MMPI-2RF, which basically means that MMPI-2RF findings, the literature on the MMPI-2RF versions of these scales can be applied when scoring them on the and interpreting them on the MMPI-3. So findings from the MMPI-2RF technical manual can be applied, as well as the now the slide says 450, but we're actually over 480 peer-reviewed MMPI-2RF publications will apply to interpretation of the MMPI-3. In terms of comparison groups, these are listed in Appendix F of the technical manual. We'll have 20 comparison groups when the test is first released in a couple of weeks. We're going to be adding comparison groups with time. We'll have, of course, a separate comparison group for the men and women in the Spanish language normative sample. We're collecting field data for Spanish language comparison groups as well. So ongoing data is collection for comparison groups is ongoing, and as was the case with the restructured form, we will periodically add comparison groups to the MMPI-3 scoring materials. This is the manual supplement for the Spanish language version. It includes information about the need for a Spanish language translation and norms, a description of the development of the test and the normative sample, reliability, standard error of measurement, and validity data, as well as some best practices. And as you just saw, or I can show you again, Tony Puente, of course, is a co-author of the manual supplement, and he was the person responsible for providing the best practices recommendations. There is also a French-Canadian translation available of the MMPI-3. We don't have separate norms, but there is a French translation, a Canadian translation. This is the user's guide for the score and clinical interpretive reports. We're going to use a case. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over the background in detail here. It'll be available in the handout that you can download, but it's a case that's included in the user's guide to illustrate various aspects of the score and interpretive report. So this is our score report for the MMPI-3. For those who are familiar with the MMPI-2RF reports, it will have some familiar features, such as the hash marks that indicate the highest and lowest possible T-scores on the various scales of the MMPI-3. Response percent is the percent scoreable responses on each scale. If that percentage falls below 90, we have to qualify our interpretation of scores on that scale, and it will be printed in bold, as it is here for the F scale, to draw your attention to the fact that we have only 89% scoreable responses to the F scale items in this particular protocol. For the substantive scales, you can see that we have 3 lines drawn, one at T-score 65, one at 50, and then for identifying low scores at a T-score of 38. In this case, we have elevations on several higher order and restructured clinical scales, as well as some of the internalizing scales for Mr. J, and these are the externalizing and interpersonal scales. You can see below in the third row of numbers that we have a number of additional scales identified as having less than 90% scoreable responses, which again would be taken into account in the interpretation. The next page of the score report is a summary page that provides all 52 scale scores on one page in a somewhat different structure. In fact, the structure that we recommend using when interpreting scores on the MMPI-3. The score report also includes item level information that is not reproduced. The item content itself and item numbers are not reproduced in this slide in order to maintain test security, but in the actual reports, the item number and the actual content of each item will be listed in terms of unscorable responses, critical responses. All of that information will be included as part of the score report. In terms of the clinical interpretive report, it includes, as indicated here, annotation and references that I'll show you here shortly. Of course, it also includes all of the elements of the score report, all the profile pages. I won't show them again. So the first change that you'll see if you're using the interpretive report is the summary page. Every scale that's interpreted in the report is printed in bold on the summary page. So that gives you kind of a one-page look at which scales triggered an interpretation in the interpretive report for clinical settings. The report then begins with a synopsis of the summary of the main findings in the case, and then an analysis of the validity of the protocol. In this case, recall that the F scale had less than 89% scoreable responses, so there is an analysis of the implications of those unscorable responses for the possibility of undetected overreporting on the F scale that's illustrated here in this case. Every statement in the report, this is just the first statement in the emotional dysfunction part of the interpretation, is followed by a superscripted number. These numbers are used for the annotation that we'll discuss here in a moment. After the interpretation of scores, we move on to diagnostic considerations and treatment considerations. Again, the same item level information with redacted content here for test security reasons. And then the endnotes are linked to those superscripted numbers. They tell you for every statement in the report whether it's based on content, in which case it'll say test responses or empirical correlates, or as an inference of the report authors. And for those cases that are identified, or those statements, I should say, that are identified as being based on empirical correlates, you can see that reference numbers are listed following the scale, the indication of which scale triggered that statement. And those references appear in the research reference list, which is unique to each interpretive report. If you're looking at the interpretive report on a computer screen and the computer is connected to the internet, the blue highlights are hyperlinks to the abstracts for the articles that are cited in support of the empirical correlate-based statements in the report. And of course, initially, many of these references will be MMPI-2RF studies, and as we add MMPI-3 studies, these references will be updated. There are some customization options for the reports. Both the score report and the clinical interpretive report can include comparison groups. If you select one of the comparison groups, the mean for the comparison group is plotted along with a shaded bar indicating a range of plus or minus 1 standard deviation from the mean. This is the actual test takers' scores, which in this case we can see falls outside that standard deviation bar for Mr. J. We're still looking at Mr. J's scores. And then the third row, or last row of numbers, I should say, is the percent of individuals in the comparison group scoring at or below the test taker, in this case, Mr. J. So we can see that his T-score of 39 on the CRIN scale falls at the fourth percentile. These numbers are essentially analogous to 2 percentiles, and that gives us an indication of just how uncommonly consistent Mr. J was in responding to the MMPI-3 items in this case. The item level information will include some information specific to the comparison group, in addition to the normative sample, in terms of the frequency of responses in the key direction in both the normative sample and the comparison group. We can also add item level information in addition to the critical scales that Tellegen and I identified. You can select any MMPI-3 scale for inclusion and get the item level information for that particular scale. In this case here, we can see the demoralization, RC2, self-doubt, inefficacy, and on the next page, several additional scales were selected. And again, that's an option that you can use as needed. There's also information about interfacing with the Pearson software, Q Local and Q Global, for the in the user's guide for reports. We have a separate user's guide for the police candidate interpretive report, and we'll be providing separate webinars and information about the updated, or the MMPI-3 version, I should say, of the police candidate interpretive report. So I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions, and we're at the question and answer section, so we'll get ready to have someone from Pearson read off the questions. I do also want to call to your attention that, here we go, for anyone interested in a workshop, a full-day workshop, we're going to be offering them beginning at the end of this month. And this is the information you see here on this slide. So I'm going to leave this slide up for the question and answer part of the presentation, and open it up for questions.
Dr. Ben-Porath, this is Deb. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great, great, great. Okay, we have lots of questions for you, many of which you probably have answered in some way, shape, or form as you moved through your presentation. But let's start with some about norms. There is an individual here who asked early on, how did you calculate how many of each of the normative sample groups to achieve validity and reliability for the test?
So those are two separate matters, actually. So the normative sample was composed in order to match the projections, as I mentioned, for the 2020 census for the adult population of the United States. We used field data to run analyses that we were able, with those analyses, to look at the revised or potentially revised scales to maintain, or in some cases enhance, the validity of the scales. So those were done on the basis of analyses with our field data. And for anyone interested in details, more details than I'm able to describe here briefly, those are in Chapter 2 of the technical manual.
Great. Question here, can you expand on the rationale of the difference between the outpatient mental health community center versus the outpatient private settings?
Yeah, we've always had, also for the MMPI-2RF, two different outpatient comparison group settings: community mental health and private practice. They tend to serve somewhat different populations in terms of the demographic composition, and sometimes the level of care needed. And so if you actually look, and the numbers are reported in the technical manual for the means and standard deviations for those two groups, they're more similar than they are dissimilar, but there are some differences. And so this would allow you to compare a test taker's scores to the relevant cohort, whether the person is being seen in community mental health or in a private practice setting as an outpatient.
Okay, great. Couple more questions about Spanish before we move on to scale questions. What Spanish dialect do you know was used for the translation of the MMPI-3?
So as I mentioned, the starting point is the Garcia-Azan translation of the MMPI-2 that was also used for the MMPI-2RF. So it's the same, essentially the same Spanish version. I can't get into specifics. I can tell you that the people who did the initial translation were both of Cuban origin, as is Tony Puente, although Tony recruited specifically for his team, and we talk about this in the manual supplement. Spanish speakers from other countries' origins as well. And there's been a literature looking at the MMPI-2 translation that indicates that it works fairly well across different types of Spanish language dialects. But beyond that, I'm not able to go into any detail.
Okay, one more question about the Spanish sample. Was information about how long the individual was living in the U.S., as well as a level of acculturation, collected for the Spanish language norms?
So we didn't ask that particular question. All of the individuals tested were living in the U.S. They obviously had to be Spanish speakers, fluent Spanish speakers. Part of the recruitment of the normative sample, both English and Spanish, the Eureka Facts, the company that I mentioned, did the data collection, did some initial screening of thousands of individuals by phone, and then selected those who met the targeted criteria. So we did not ask how long they'd been in the U.S., and we did not administer a measure of acculturation. I know that there are plans to collect some data and look more specifically at that particular issue. But this was a sample that was, again, collected strictly for being native Spanish speakers who are more comfortable speaking Spanish than they are English.
Okay, move on to questions. A couple of questions here about scales. You did an overview of them. Can you talk about whether or not there is a scale related to trauma or PTSD?
So the anxiety-related scale includes quite a few items that I think would represent various manifestations of PTSD, including excessive startle, intrusive ideation, preoccupation with past experiences causing anxiety. The anxiety scale on the MMPI-2RF was our best indicator of the likely presence of features of PTSD, and we find the same with the MMPI-3, that the anxiety-related experiences scale is correlated substantially with features of PTSD. It's not unique or specific. We don't have any scale on the MMPI-3 that's linked to one and only one type of disorder, because of the various psychiatric disorders, including PTSD, are complex. They have different manifestations. So the anxiety-related experiences scale will capture the anxiety features of PTSD, but other things, such as in some cases, for example, social isolation or lack of interest in social interaction, that's going to show up in our interpersonal scales on the MMPI-3. But in terms of features of trauma and correlations, for example, we have correlations with the detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress, the DAPS in the technical manual, in a sample of disability claimants, and the anxiety-related experiences scale is the one that correlates most highly with the various scales of the DAPS in that sample.
Great, thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the new validity scale, CRIN? Is that simply the sum of TRIN and VRIN?
So it's not simply the sum of VRIN and TRIN. It's the sum of VRIN and then the true inconsistent responses on TRIN and the false inconsistent responses on TRIN that are usually not added up in scoring. But it basically, the idea behind the CRIN scale is to give us an overall indication of the level of inconsistent responding, regardless of how. Is it in the same direction or is it in the opposite direction? So the CRIN scale gives us that overall indication. And included on the CRIN scale are about half of the MMPI-3 items. So it really does give us the broadest indication. And then VRIN tells us whether it's more variable inconsistent responding, where one response is true and the other is false. And TRIN, of course, tells us whether it's fixed inconsistent responding in either the true or the false direction. So the CRIN gives us a broader indication and a little bit more information.
Great. I'm aware of time. We have about 5 more minutes, so we'll try to get a few more questions in here. Are you planning to take any steps toward validating the MMPI-3 for administration via teleassessment, which is a really big topic these days?
Yeah, so we are presently have been collecting data still with the MMPI-2RF and actually developing some research that will be published in the not too distant future, establishing the comparability of scores with remote administration, with telehealth, with the MMPI. And of course, there's no reason to expect that the results will be any different with the MMPI-3, but we will be doing such research with the MMPI-3 as well. Recall that I mentioned earlier that almost all of the normative data were collected by computer, and so which of course is a big element, and for those who are using paper and pencil, it's a difference from the in-person assessment. But the preliminary data that we've been looking at show that we get very comparable results. As long as you follow the procedures, the recommended procedures. Dave Corey and I have published a paper with some recommended procedures for remote administration of the MMPI, any version of the MMPI. And as long as you follow those procedures and importantly monitor the administration, you will be getting comparable results. We had no reason to expect otherwise, and our data are indicating that that in fact is the case.
Great. And so there's a couple of questions about this, what I think is going to be the last question given our time, but it's about code types. A few people have mentioned that they've found code types in the past to be very useful for interpretation and report writing. Can you speak a little bit to code types and use or not use with the MMPI-3?
Sure. So the code types were invented, I mentioned at the very beginning part of the presentation that the clinical scales didn't work as intended, and the code types really were invented as plan B. And they were based on a model that essentially classified people into different groups and types and then characterized their personality and psychopathology on the basis of empirical correlates of those types. The fields of personality and psychopathology over the past 2 decades at least have really moved away from these kind of categorical models to more dimensional models of personality and psychopathology. And that process began with the introduction on the MMPI with the Psy-5 scales, later with the restructured clinical scales and the restructured form. So we don't classify people on the basis of patterns of scores on the MMPI-3. But what we do is have scales that focus on psychological constructs that assess and are related with the various features that we used to find in the code type literature. So it's not the case that we're not able to assess for individual differences in those features that were incorporated in the code type-based descriptions. It's just a dimensional approach, which is more consistent with current practices and with what the research tells us is actually the most a comprehensive and valid way of assessing and characterizing personality and psychopathology functioning. Now, that's not to say that certain combinations of scores aren't meaningful. They are, but there are interpretive guidelines along those lines in the manual. But we don't classify people into one and only one code type and interpret only on the basis of that code type, as was practiced with the clinical scales.
That was a very thorough response. Thank you very much. That takes us up to about 1 minute before we end. So I think it's prudent to end here without asking another question. I do want to thank you, Dr. Ben-Porath, for your time today in giving us a thorough review of the MMPI-3.
Oh, well, thank you, Deb. And again, anyone interested, I'd encourage you to attend one of our workshops.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.